Now we are going to our third session, and I would like to welcome Professor Gross from Tel Aviv. I repeat, no formality, but I cannot retain myself to thank Professor Gross for his participation and say how big is my pleasure to accept him even in this way in Thessaloniki. I will not speak about her postgraduate diploma or his postgraduate diploma or his collaborations with most famous schools and institutes, as is the Faculty of Law of Tel Aviv University, in which he teaches, as the European University Institute in Florence, as the Advanced Legal Studies Institute in London. I will only say that Professor Gross is the kind of professor I love. He is not teaching, but he is implementing law precepts and law principles in practice by participating to social movements and by writing in traditional media and new form of media. Aeyal, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you for those two kind words. Very kind introduction. I'm going to try and share my PowerPoint, so let's see if it works. 1 second. It's even after teaching in Zoom for so long, it always still takes a little minute. So 1 second. Okay. I hope it works and you see me okay, and you like this new format of PowerPoint presentation. So actually, in a way, I can say in a way my talk is in a way sort of maybe a combination of two papers. I'm not sure yet. Maybe you will help me. One of them is kind of a more general on the comparative discussion, and the other is on Israel. So the papers, but at least in this presentation, the kind of bigger theoretical points will draw on the case of Israel mostly. And let's see how it proceeds. So actually, I called my paper, as you saw, from transitional justice to democratic backsliding, because in the early 2000s, many of us were interested in this emerging field of transitional justice, including myself. And the background to it was democratic transitions in many countries, in Latin America, the fall of the juntas, in South Africa, of course, the transition to from apartheid, in Eastern Central Europe, the end of communism and the end of the Cold War. And there were also peace processes in major conflicts. So again, South Africa, Northern Ireland, Israel, Palestine, which unfortunately later collapsed. And there were the wars in Yugoslavia and Rwanda and the end of those wars. And a lot of people are interested in these transitions from war to peace, or from dictatorship or apartheid to democracy, and which mechanisms are developed to deal with these processes. And then we saw the re-emergence of international criminal law in the form of universal jurisdiction, which kind of like arose like the phoenix in the case of Pinochet. Maybe later the phoenix kind of descended again. And also in international courts, courts for Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and later the ICC, and the alternative model of restorative justice and reconciliation, the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we have a lot of interest in this discussion, and really this emerging field, which is still with us. But I want to point to some of the criticism that some of them I wrote about and other people wrote about that were engaged in this field, but also ask questions about this sharp distinction between transitional justice versus ordinary justice. I wrote about it, David Douzinas wrote about it, and a few others, and saying, look, actually, everything you're saying about transitional justice, that we need to look backward and forward, you always have to do those things. And if we go to constitutional law, Ruthie Teitel, in her famous seminal book, maybe that defines the field, talks about how usually constitution is about entrenchment. But actually, in transitional period, we want to think about constitutional law and disentrenchment, to disentrench the previous regime. But actually then some people like myself ask, well, but isn't always its problem to speak about status quo constitutionalism? We always want to think also how to disentrench, because even in established democracies, we have structures of domination, of economic power, which we want to disentrench. We always need, for example, distributive justice. And all of this brought to a bigger question: isn't the transitional justice discourse tied too much to the liberal framework that looks at constitutional democracy as the ideal liberal constitutional democracy, as the ideal that transitioning states should aspire to? And then there were a lot of discussion on how to address the crimes of the past, how to establish democratic institutions. I would say less so, at least in the beginning, less discussion of the economic. Also later there was some more discussion of the economic. Now, 20 years later, lo and behold, we are no longer talking about how to achieve, how we are transitioning to democracy. We are talking, maybe the mirror image, how we are transitioning from democracy. And to some extent, the discussion is very close, because many of the countries we are talking about, like Poland or Hungary, are the very same countries that we're considering how they are transitioning to democracy in the transitional justice discussion. And before we know it, we are wondering how are they transitioning from democracy. And I would say that the democratic decline or backsliding discussion, or maybe populist constitutionalism, as we are talking about today, has been taking over constitutional law discourse in a tsunami similar or maybe even bigger to the transitional justice discourse 20 years ago. But I also think that the discussion sometimes suffers from the same problems that were identified in some of the transitional justice discourse, a sort of idealization of liberal democracy as a benchmark, now no longer the one we should aspire to reach, but now the one which we should lament, and maybe how we should save it, return to it, etc. I would say that the economic is more present in the discussion, I think, from the beginning. The economic crisis is often cited alongside the refugee crisis as a backrise to the rise of populism, to the decline of liberal democracy. So the economic is more present from the beginning of this emergence of this discipline. It took it some time, I think, to take a more central stage in the transitional justice discourse. Now, I recall the famous saying from Simone Signoret that nostalgia is not what it used to be, because sometimes my feeling is that in reading some of this literature, and even being part of it myself, is that there's some kind of nostalgia to pre-decline liberal democracies. How we had this wonderful liberal democracy until Orban, Netanyahu, Trump, Bolsonaro, Chavez, we don't want to neglect the left populists, until they destroyed it. And I'm Boyan is here, so I'm mindful, the authoritarian populists, right, the bad ones. But I think much of this discussion needs to address more the extent to which liberal democracy, in its what I call neoliberal version that was dominant from the 80s in many countries, but even before, failed to deliver on its promises as something that will benefit all of society. The promise for better economic welfare for the population, which was supposed to be the benchmark promise in post-World War II constitution in at least some countries, and maybe post-1989 one in other countries, I'm not sure, was neglected when liberalism was replaced by neoliberalism in the 80s. Maybe it was doomed to fail because liberal democracy espoused capitalism even in its social democratic version. And this is a question that I still want to ask, right? Is there a problem that we neglected it in the 80s, or is it doomed to fail because we already adopted capitalism in the social democratic version of, I know it may sound like a almost contradiction, but I hope you get my point. Now, I want to say in a few minutes I have left, a few things about the case of Israel, And as I said, I'm not sure yet whether those are two separate papers or one. Israel is often considered as part of those countries where we have democratic decline. We have, it's for example included, and we have Yaniv Rosnai, I see him, who wrote the chapter on Israel in this book on constitutional democracy in crisis. Part of liberal democracy is threatened by the populist tide. Now, I want to speak more about the specifics. And one specific I want to talk about is occupation. And I'm moving from the economic to maybe the ethnic, national, etc. Because as you know, since 1967, Israel has been occupying the occupied Palestinian territory. And this long-term occupation, according to many writers, actually undermines the basic assumption of the existence of liberal democracy as the baseline. Now, I will go to that back in a minute and explain why it's important. We also have other specifics which I want to put on the table, which are within the Jewish population in Israel, intra-Jewish ethnic questions, which are not always addressed enough in the international arena. There is a divide between Jews of European ancestry, Ashkenazi, and Jews of North African and Arab ancestry, Mizrahi Jews, which significantly overlaps economic gaps. And by the way, Thessaloniki is a very important city in the history of Sephardic Jews, which sometimes now we call Mizrahi Jews, but that's another discussion, this terminology. And this divide overlaps economic gaps, and I think it's crucial to understanding also the weak status of liberal democracy in Israel, because a lot of the Jewish population, which is from the lower social economic status, which often overlaps with Sephardic or Mizrahi ethnicity, felt that actually this something that today many people in the Israeli left idealize or want to return to this liberal democracy of the 80s or whenever we had it, that it never served them, that it actually always served elites to begin with. And this is a question that I think we have to address in this false, what I call this false nostalgia. Why was the liberal civil rights discourse in Israel considered as alienated from part of society alongside economic and ethnic lines? For whom did it never deliver? And why today, when we ask about this decline, we shouldn't have this ideal of this liberal democracy we had and we lost, but we also have to ask what was wrong with it, or what was wrong with liberal democracy, or what was wrong with this specific liberal democracy, or was it even a liberal democracy? And here, when we talk about the role of constitutional law, there's a lot of research that I did and many other people did, how the Israeli Supreme Court preferred civil and political rights to socio-economic rights. I want to mention one case, 2005, the Israeli government, under economic austerity program, cut the income support for poor people in about 1/3. There was a petition to Supreme Court, and the court said there was no violation of the right to human dignity. It gave it a very narrow interpretation. So this is an example, this is the most famous example, how cutting people's welfare significantly is part of the human rights course addressed by the court, headed by Chief Stasis Barak, which we, including myself, all adore and see the lighthouse of human rights and democracy in Israel. But we have to remember, this did not include a robust protection of social and economic rights. So moreover, I want to ask what was the role in Israel, but in other countries too, of constitutional law in undermining the promise of welfare to society, and arguably support, and maybe in a way supporting or giving support to the populist idea that constitutional liberal democracy is a project of elites which will not benefit the population as a whole. And this, of course, notwithstanding, there's a lot of populist agenda I'm highly critical of, but I also think that people want to defend the democracy and human rights must ask those questions. And of course, we have the question of also, if we go to another specificity, and I mentioned the occupation before, how is populism and constitutional changes critical in the specific context to entrench an ethnic regime of occupation, also of rejection of asylum seekers, which I don't have the time to go into, but I will just say that the current kind of populist attack on the constitutional democracy and rights in Israel, a lot of it has to do with the court judgment on asylum seekers. But this also has to do with the ethnic nature. So I think we should ask more how the populism is about entrenching an ethnic nature, ethnic hegemony, but also ask about how did this ethnic hegemony existed before. So we have if we want to talk about the specific of what we call the current backsliding in Israel, we have the occupation and ethnicity context, which I think is critical, but we also have to talk what was the limit of the success of reach of liberalism within Israel and who was left out. Of course, we have today specific issues regarding Netanyahu, including the specificities of the way he is engaged in attacking the legal system because of his trial of corruption when he wants to delegitimize it, and also the specifics, which I don't have to go into, of the use of the emergency powers according under the COVID-19 pandemic for more authoritarianism. But just to bring everything together, actually there were restrictions on demonstrations which were done at Netanyahu's initiative, supposedly for protection from COVID-19, but then we can also say, as a way for the government to protect itself from demonstration. I would, by the way, those restrictions indeed were overturned by the Israel Supreme Court. So to conclude, and I put quite a lot on the table, but I hope that you see how it all ties up, that we need to consider both the limits of, I think, the nostalgic liberal model and think, was this model good enough, or especially in its new liberal model, which was dominant in the 80s, and which civil rights discourse or human rights discourse hardly gave protection from. The limits of the comparative discussion, which often doesn't look at specificities and put this benchmark of liberal democracy we should save or return to. We have to ask what is the problem in the liberal starting point as a presumed benchmark. The ideal would deteriorated from in the democratic decline or populism discourse, or we should aspire to in the transitional justice discourse. And what is the limits of the populism critique? And here I go back to our opening keynote. We are very concerned with the rise of authoritarian populism, but how do we not use it in a way that actually delegitimize critiques of liberal democracy? And here, like others, I recall Chantal Mouffe's idea for a need for less populism, and Boyan Bugarich's critique of this idea of populism as necessarily bad. And so I will just stop here, and thank you very much for listening, and again for the very kind introduction from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Aeyal. Allow me to put this question: how liberal is a state? How liberal is the Greek state, who built our university on the Jewish cemetery of Thessaloniki, one of the biggest Israeli cities in the world? And I think that the answer can be given by the issue of a trial that is held this period, a trial against the decision of municipality of Thessaloniki to rename a street. This street was named during dictatorship, and it was given the name of a commandant of the city during Nazi's occupation. And 5-6 years ago, the municipality decided to change the name of the street and give it the name of an Israeli Greek poet. And some citizens related to the commandant of the Nazi period went to the courts, and the trial is held. And I think the decision of the court will confirm or deny the liberal character of actual Greek state. So next intervenant is Roila Mavrouli, a young and promising jurist who has published a thesis concerning la controverse constitutionnelle grecque sur l'article 120 en période de crise, étude de la compétence controversée du peuple en tant qu'organe de l'État. Et avant, before to give the floor to Roila, I would like to notice that Roila is one of the rare women participating in this Congress, in this conference. And I'm wondering if populism is hostile to women. Roila, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here, to be with you here today. A big thank you to the organizers of this amazing conference. I will just start by, I will share my screen. Do you see my slide or not?
It's okay.
Okay. So this presentation today will focus on what some may call a movement of illiberal democracies that is taking hold in Europe. So many European bodies and legal scholars have expressed serious concerns about legal changes and the way of studying this phenomenon from the legal point of view. So I will not focus on the populist aspect, not because I'm afraid of it, but I will tend to analyze the term illiberal democracies, which is so in fashion these days, in a way that talking about illiberal democracies seems like we have to deal with a new constitutional phenomenon, even if I don't think that it is the case. So my presentation will raise 3 points. Firstly, I will resume the concept of illiberal democracies as theorized by Farid Zakaria in 1997. Then, in a second time, I will show if the term illiberal democracy is appropriate, or if a different term, such as democratorship, would better fit to describe these regimes, and if we can talk about the hybridization of democracy with dictatorship. And then I will raise a last point, underlining the connection between positivism, legal positivism, and the rise of illiberal democracies in a way that positivism maybe functions as a trap. First point, illiberal democracy according to Farid Zakaria. So Farid Zakaria, in his article, The Rise of Illiberal Democracy, already in 1997, he conceptualized the term as following. Illiberal democracies are democratically elected regimes, often ones that have been re-elected or reaffirmed through referenda, are routinely ignoring constitutional limits on their power and depriving their citizens of basic rights and freedoms. So he points out that it is difficult to recognize the problem because for almost a century in the West, democracy has meant liberal democracy. So he describes illiberal democracies as an erosion of the constitution pursued by popular political leaders who bypass their parliaments and rule by presidential decree. However, he distinguishes illiberal democracies from near tyrannies. Within near tyrannies, he says that elections are not characterized by the same degree of freedom and fairness as the ordinary elections. So, for the author, illiberal democracy is not a temporary or transitional stage, but a form of government that, I quote, mixes a substantial degree of democracy with a substantial degree of illiberalism. He insists on the idea that Western liberal democracy might prove to be not the final destination, but just one of many possible exits. So he says illiberal democracies gain legitimacy from the fact that they are reasonably democratic. And this brings me to my second point, the hybridization of democracy and the different shades of gray that we can see within it. So Fareed Zakaria's conceptualization of illiberal democracy does not allow for a deepening to the gray zones of illiberalism. His codification refers to two types of democracy, illiberal democracy and liberal dictatorship, which can both be described as democratorships. So his proposed typology is quite basic, quite elementary, and does not elucidate what separates liberal democracy from full dictatorship. So we can find more than 50 shades of democratorships within his typology that are not illustrated because a perfect liberal democracy does not exist. So that means that we cannot actually find a solid series of criteria based either on violation of human rights and liberties, on the weakening of the separation of powers, or on the violation of law. And these criteria would be able to define illiberal democracies as such. So the weakening of institutional counterpowers is not enough, is not sufficient on its own to define illiberal democracies. The example of the Article 16 of the French Constitution illustrates this argument, because according to Article 16 of the French Constitution, the president can have full powers in case of emergency. Someone could qualify, could say that France is a democratorship just because of this article. Nevertheless, this criterion on its own is not enough in order to fulfill this objective. Is France an illiberal democracy or a democratorship on the sole ground of Article 16 of the French Constitution? I don't think so. In constitutional law, we say that it is analyzed as a semi-presidential democratic regime. So Fareed Zakaria writes that the manipulation of the constitution is a criterion that qualifies illiberal democracies as such. However, the violation of law is not, once again, a solid criterion on its own in order to define them. Again, the example of the French Republic. We have the manipulation of the French Constitution by Charles de Gaulle and his election directly by the people without consulting the Assembly, in violation of the constitutional procedure regarding presidential elections in 1962. According to Article 89 of the French Constitution, constitutional revision initiated by the president had to be approved by both chambers before being submitted either to a referendum or to a vote in joint sitting by both chambers. So de Gaulle put his constitutional reform directly to a referendum based on a different article of the Constitution. And when parliamentarians petitioned the Constitutional Council, it actually refused to recognize its competence over the judicial review, arguing that referenda are the direct expression of national sovereignty. So de Gaulle's democracy or popular democracy questioned, for some constitutionalists, the legitimacy of the Fifth French Republic. A part of the French doctrine defended the idea according to which the Fifth French Republic has been disaggregated from the inside, distancing itself from the principles on which it was founded. So de Gaulle's direct election would be an original sin or an institutional coup d'etat. For them, the transition to the Sixth Republic was the only solution in order to repair the original sin caused by de Gaulle. However, even if the constitution had been set aside in order to give power to the people, the Fifth French Republic has never been called as a democratorship or any liberal democracy. So from a positivist point of view, evoking the existence of a political regime represented by democratorships or illiberal democracies would amount to accepting the idea that a new scientific term was born to identify a new regime. However, it seems impossible to identify it. That's why authors talk about 50 shades of democratorships. the same question as to the tautology of certain concepts such as semi-democracy, semi-authoritarianism, illegal or defective democracy, electoral or competitive authoritarianism. Can these terms be used interchangeably or not? And actually one of the difficulties of this task is undoubtedly that illiberal democracy is most often governed by a supreme norm, the constitution, that presents all the aspects of the constitution of a liberal democracy. So it is therefore the hijacking of its provisions, the manipulation of his provisions, or even the use of the constitutional provisions for illiberal purposes, which would characterize the illiberal democracy as such. So the difficulty of classifying illiberal democracy among the regimes studied by constitutional law appears especially important when the constitutional legitimation and the neutrality of the constitution function as a trap and not as a safeguard for the protection of rights and freedoms. It's because the discourse on illiberal democracy is built through respect for the constitution, which, far from preventing it, it actually reinforces it through constitutional legitimacy. In this sense, law, and most specifically positive law, functions as a catalyst legitimizing the illiberal onslaught using the same words, the same language, and the same legal instruments, such as the constitution. So this will bring me to the last point, democracy, liberalism, and positivism. What we understand today, for example, in Hungary, with the term illiberal democracy, as proclaimed by Viktor Orban, it is quite different from what Fareed Zakaria called in 1997 illiberal democracy. Even if in a way, illiberal democracy as a concept predates Viktor Orban's illiberal democracy, we can say that it is different from all the previous experiences of dictatorship. And even if the term illiberal democracy is not accepted unanimously by the legal discourse, the recent reality of its political rhetoric, it's quite present. It seems like the widespread trend towards illiberalism in Hungary, for example, is a result of a general critique of liberalism as an overly political and intellectual form of thinking. Human rights remotely attached to democracy and the rule of law are perceived not to be neutral, but rather as instruments of particular groups of society. So liberal democratic societies are often criticized as being too individualistic, too egoistic, and unequal, as liberal democratic law becomes for some a capitalist defense. In other words, illiberal democracy is the consequence of a strong critique of the dominant role of political and economic liberalism. So what's the role of law in all this? Western constitutionalism has set its origins in the liberal revolutions of the late 18th century. So legal positivism, however, tries to account for the law's role in stabilizing expectations, proving law's rightness by considering it as impermeable to extra-legal principles. So the prevailing legal paradigm is that the democratic constitution is confined to provide the framework for the separation of powers and to guarantee citizens' rights against state interference. So this resurgence, this reapparition of illiberal democracies in Europe questions the ideological aspects of democracy. However, legal positivism does not allow judgments of value, praising the neutral nature of law. So democracy is a form of government that disqualifies everyone from claiming the capacity to glean from nature or from reason the validity of universal rules and principles. And this attachment of democracy to legal positivism has come to a theoretical impasse provoked by this revival of illiberal democracies. Because in a way, if rules, principles, and fundamental rights are not universal and do not derive from nature or from reason, illiberal democracies can turn to different rules and different principles. Thus, the constitution remains neutral because it's the legal instrument that represents first and foremost the institutions and the procedures, and does not provide the necessary elements for the material protection of democracy. So the presence of a chapter or a declaration of fundamental rights in the constitutional text can delay the demolition process, but can never prevent it. So illiberalism seems to take the form of ideological commitments, as proclaimed in particular by the Orban regime, and often portrayed as the democratic backlash, dismantling the institutional rule of law guarantees. It does not, however, proceed to a systematic abuse of fundamental rights and freedoms. So liberal democracy, remotely attached to positivism, creates a sort of a catch of an entanglement. Positivism proliferates procedural and agnostical propositions regarding the essence or the nature of democracy, in order to avoid judgments of value that could degenerate perhaps to fascism or to natural law ideas. However, this minimizes the role of law into a simple formalistic role of shaping the democratic expression. And I will just conclude with this. Constitutional science today endeavors to conciliate the neutrality of law with substantial guarantees such as human rights and fundamental liberties. However, human rights are considered to be judgments of value over democratic expressions. So from this perspective, the practice of law is characterized by the prevalence of essence over the form, over the democratic form. And this mechanism has opened the gates to the illiberal movement, actually, which perceives law as an empire and the judges as humans with superpowers. So the transition from the form, the democratic form, to the essence of democracy nourishes, strengthens the illiberal movement with the following rhetoric. The people is dispossessed from its political autonomy in favor of a legal elite out of all reach. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roila. In Entre's tradition, we have linked questions of substantial law with questions of methodology and epistemology of law. Thank you very much. I would like to remind all participants that they can ask questions in the chat if they do not want to take the floor after the interventions. And now it's to one of ours to take the floor, Nikolas Vagdoutis. Nikolas is a postdoctoral researcher at the Law School of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. He had graduated from the Law School of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and he had a PhD from the University of Glasgow. The thesis title is Hans Kelsen and Carl Schmitt in Weimar, a riddle political constitutionalism. That's why I didn't say anything about Roila's intervention. Nikolas is an active member of our program, and he's also a cadre, I don't know how to say in English, of a very important independent agency in Greece. Nikola.
Thank you very much for your kind words, Ifigeneia. Only one correction, that I have been a graduate of the law school of the National Kapodistria University of Athens in Greece, but this is a minor issue. So yeah, thank you very much for your kind words. I'm very happy that I have been given this opportunity to present my paper at this international conference. My presentation will explore the extent to which populism is always oppositional to liberalism through the emphasis on the analysis of Carl Schmitt's interwar theory until 1933. So his theory during Nazism will not be taken into account here. However, this topic will be approached not through the apt distinction between democratic populism and authoritarian populism that has been already developed by Professors Bugaritz, Blocher, and Halmai. As it could be also seen today, they all agree, despite their differences of opinion, that there is a democratic variant of populism that is compatible, at least to a significant extent, with liberalism. My paper, my presentation here, will explore not this compatibility between democratic populism and liberalism, but the complementarity between a certain kind of populism, authoritarian populism, and a certain kind of liberalism, authoritarian liberalism, that is detached from democracy. This will be explored through demonstrating the combination between features of authoritarian populism and authoritarian liberalism in Schmitt's theory. So the structure of my presentation will be the following one. Firstly, the concept of populism and the reasons for which Schmitt's theory fits into this concept, and more particularly into its variant of authoritarian populism, will be illuminated. Secondly, Schmitt's authoritarian liberalism will be brought into light. And thirdly, the significance of the complementarity between Schmitt's authoritarian liberalism and authoritarian populism for the contemporary study of populism will be explored. I will start from the first section of my presentation, which will be shorter. And I will start from a definition of populism in order to proceed then to Schmitt's relation to populism. According to Jan Werner Müller, the three basic features of populism are the following ones. Firstly, a moralized form of anti-pluralism. Secondly, anti-elitism. And thirdly, the reliance on a non-institutionalized notion of the people that is not grounded, therefore, in parliamentary representation. So there are these three features of populism, according to Jan Werner Müller. Because of these elements, because of these features, and notably of Schmitt's anti-pluralism, notably of anti-pluralism, populism has been considered as hostile both to liberalism and to democracy. That's because liberalism's guarantee of pluralism is conceived as a precondition for democracy. As Urbinati put it, populism seeks state power to implement a political agenda whose main and recognizable character is hostility against liberalism and the principles of constitutional democracy, in particular minority rights, division of powers, and party pluralism. End of quote. Now, Schmitt's interwar theory has been associated with populism primarily because it rejects pluralism. That's because Schmitt develops a state theory that is based on the homogeneity and self-identity of the people, as he writes. According to Carl Schmitt, democracy requires first homogeneity, and second, if the need arises, elimination or eradication of heterogeneity, as he notoriously remarked. Schmitt's concept of political representation is based, therefore, on the expression of a homogeneous people. This takes place not through the various political parties in parliament, given that those political parties express heterogeneous social interests, but through a leader that stands supposedly above those interests. Hence, against Weimar parliamentarism, Schmitt counterposes the concept of acclamation, as it is named, namely, the possibility of the people to say merely a yes or no to leader suggestions without the parliament's mediation. This concept was developed in his constitutional theory, as it is well known. This theory of Carl Schmitt fulfills the basic feature of populism. That's because, firstly, it is based on a homogeneous anti-pluralist concept of identity, and secondly, it is grounded in a homogeneous notion of the people that opposes parliamentary representation. As Urbinati writes, for Schmitt, parliament is an assemblage of elected who represent interests, parties, and social classes, while the president is elected by the entire German people. Hence, Urbinati associated directly Schmitt's argument in favor of a presidential regime with modern populism. Schmitt's difference with populism seems to be merely that he does not adopt an anti-elitist discourse. On this particular issue, he follows Weber, Max Weber. However, there are two questions that should be posed here. Firstly, could Schmitt's interwar theory describe populism in any variant? Blocher and Bugaritz have shown that there is a democratic variant of populism that is different from an authoritarian one. According to Bugaritz, democratic anti-establishment populism combines elements of liberal and democratic convictions. So the above-mentioned features of Schmitt's theory could fit merely into what is named as authoritarian populism. Authoritarian populism is the variant of populism that, as Bugaritz writes, contradicts the key principles of modern democratic constitutionalism. Secondly, regarding the second question that I want to pose, I will explore in a much more extensive way now the extent to which Schmitt's authoritarian populism is anti-liberal. This will be the second section of my presentation. On the one hand, Schmitt's authoritarian populism is undoubtedly anti-liberal to the extent that it is anti-pluralist. However, on the other hand, there are also liberal elements that can be revealed only if we dig deep into Schmitt's theory. These liberal assumptions can be seen initially in the way in which Schmitt analyzed parliamentarism. Although he opposed parliament, he did not reject parliamentarism as such. He rejected merely 20th century mass democratic parliamentarism in contrast with 19th century parliamentarism that was based on a liberal state-civil society divide, namely on the autonomy of the state from various social interests. 19th century parliament was conceived by Schmitt as a forum for public deliberation among elites that were independent of party ties and free from selfish interests, as he writes. That is government by discussion, as Schmitt wrote. Based on this picture of the parliament, of the 19th century parliament, Schmitt did not reject a priori parliamentarism, but he tied parliamentarism to the model of 19th century parliament. However, during the 20th century Weimar state, parliament, as he writes, had lost its previous foundation and its meaning. That's because it allowed, according to him, firstly, the expression of the heterogeneous social interest through the mass political parties. As Schmitt writes, modern mass democracy has made argumentative public discussion an empty formality, and it has turned parliamentarism into a conscious reckoning of interests and chances for power in the parties' negotiation. So that's the first. And secondly, through this Weimar parliament, he argues actually that the boundaries between state and society have been dissolved, given parliament's intervention primarily in the economic sphere. Due to this, there was a politicization of the social question, which unbalanced the steadfast state civil society distinction and the dominant 19th century constitutionalism. This 20th century state is named by Schmitt as total, and it is considered by him as a weak state, given that, as he writes, the state intervenes, I quote now, the state intervenes in every area of life because it must fulfill the claims of all interested parties. It must especially become involved in the area of economy, which until now was free of state interference. So the significant issue here for Schmitt is the state intervention in the economy. To put it otherwise, the problem for Schmitt is that the democratic parliamentary Weimar state was also a social state. However, despite Schmitt's critique to this weak total state, he argued that a backward move to the liberal neutral state of the 19th century, in which there was a distinction between the state and the civil society, is impossible. His solution in the condition of the Weimar total state is clear. He argues that there is a need for a, I quote now, for a stable authority in order to move ahead the necessary depoliticizations and to re-establish free spheres and living spaces from within itself. This is what he wrote in 1932. This would be undertaken by a strong qualitative total state, as Schmitt named it. This would be an authoritarian state that, as he writes, does not contemplate surrendering new powers of coercion to its own enemies and destroyers, thus bearing its power under such formulae as liberalism, rule of law, etc. This authoritarian state would be able to redraw the distinction between the political and the economic. In other words, Schmitt's purpose was primarily to oppose democratic constitutionalism through an authoritarian state that would protect economic liberalism and that would maintain the 19th century political economic divide, in contrast with 20th century mass democracy that enabled the politicization of the social question. Hence, as Duncan Kelly writes, the aim of Schmitt is to separate liberalism from democracy for the purposes of halting the democratic avalanche, not to criticize parliament as such. This thought of Carl Schmitt, that was developed even more visibly during the early 1930s, was named by the constitutional theorist Hermann Heller as authoritarian liberalism. Heller defined this term of authoritarian liberalism as the retreat of the authoritarian state, I quote now, as the retreat of the authoritarian state from social policy, liberalization of the economy, and dictatorial control by the state of politico-intellectual functions, end of quote. This term of authoritarian liberalism was used by Heller in 1933 in order to describe more specifically a speech that Schmitt delivered before the Rhineland industrialists in 1932. In this speech of Carl Schmitt, which has the title Strong State, Sound Economy, Schmitt argued that the important question is the following one. How can one today render the distinction between state and economy effective? This is what he asked. And he answered that only a strong state can depoliticize. So it becomes visible that Schmitt's strong state aimed at restoring the 19th century political economic divide through an authoritarian state. Heller's term, authoritarian liberalism, is therefore apt because it shows that Schmitt's suggestion for an authoritarian presidential state detached economic liberalism from democratic parliamentarism, prioritizing the former, economic liberalism. So my provisional conclusion before my third section is that Schmitt's attack was primarily on democracy and also on political liberalism to the extent that this latter constitutes the precondition of democracy. However, it was not an attack against liberalism in toto, in the sense that Schmitt tried to restore through his authoritarian theory the distinction between the political and the economic, which is a basic presupposition of liberalism. Schmitt's theory shows therefore that populism is not necessarily hostile to liberalism in toto. His combination of authoritarian populism with authoritarian liberalism is seen in the institutional figure that Schmitt considers as embodying his concept of the authoritarian state. This is the figure of the president. The president would address the people in an unmediated way, in Schmitt's theory, that's the populist element, but only because he would be a pouvoir neutre, as he calls it, namely, the president would be considered as totally autonomous from the various social interests. He would be the one that would restore the 19th century political economic divide through his autonomy. That's the liberal element in Schmitt's theory. It is not accidental that Schmitt borrowed this figure of pouvoir neutre from a 19th century liberal but not a Republican theorist, Benjamin Constant. So Schmitt's authoritarian populism was related to his effort to rescue economic liberalism from a welfare state, from the Weimar welfare state actually, that was an outcome of democratic parliamentarism. However, and here is the last section of my presentation, this convergence of authoritarian populism and authoritarian liberalism in Schmitt's theory would not be revealed unless Schmitt's stance on the social question was illuminated. The social question remains nevertheless quite often neglected in the approach of populism. There is an exception to this rule, which is the approach of Bugaritz, that delves into the relation between authoritarian populism and the social question. Bugaritz draws a relation between authoritarian populism and current neoliberalism, arguing that the former should be seen as a kind of a counter-movement in the Polanyian sense of the term to the fact that the markets have been disembedded from society. As Bugaritz argued, and I quote here, a nationalist authoritarian populism combined with either economic protectionism or almost left-wing oriented social policy promises to protect the ordinary people abandoned by the liberal elite. And he continues at a later point, writing that the ruling party's obsession with fiscal austerity and with supply-side policy of privatization, deregulation, and liberalization effectively triggered a lost decade of economic stagnation, rising unemployment, increasing poverty, and dwindling EU solidarity that paved the way for the poisonous ultranationalism now on the rise. So Bugarit rightly brings into light that neoliberalism has created the conditions for the rise of a nationalist authoritarian populism. However, my argument is different. Given that it explores not the backlash of a populist economic protectionism to neoliberalism, but it explores the complementarity between authoritarian populism and authoritarian liberalism, which was demonstrated in Schmitt's theory. As seen before, Schmitt's authoritarian populism was related to his opposition to the Weimar welfare state. So Schmitt's theory could help us to explore further the complementarity between authoritarian populism and now the contemporary neoliberal governance, namely the governance that aims at releasing the economy from the political fetters of the welfare state. That's because neoliberal governance goes actually hand in hand with a new pouvoir net. That is the technocratic, unelected institutions that implement economic policies, such as the ECB, the proliferation of various independent regulatory bodies, etc. These technocratic institutions are often combined firstly with a moralistic discourse at the political level, such as the stereotype of hardworking Northern Europeans versus the lazy Southern Europeans, and secondly, with the discourse of a single possible solution that's beyond any contestation. As Mueller rightly put it, for neither technocrats nor populists is there any need for democratic debate. Each holds that there is only one correct policy solution and only one authentic popular will, respectively. So in both cases, in both authoritarian populism and in neoliberal governance, formal democratic procedures are undermined. There is in both cases an opposition to party democracy. The main point of convergence between authoritarian populism and authoritarian liberalism is therefore the denial of social conflict through their common opposition to its mediation by a 20th century democratic parliament. Due to this denial, economic liberalism is turned into a value beyond any contestation. Hence, neoliberalism can be combined with authoritarian populism because they both oppose democratic constitutionalism to the extent that democratic constitutionalism brings into light the social conflict that exists in modern capitalist societies. So it is this complementarity between authoritarian populism and neoliberal governance that needs to be explored further on the study of populism, in my view. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Nikolas. And last but not least, Amal Sethi from India. Amal is a PhD candidate, and he has learned lessons from India and will present us his thought. Amal.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Sadly, perhaps that was an old bio. My best PhD days are behind me, and that's over. But I don't think that's much of concern. So I'll just straight away dig deep into my presentation. So what my core argument is this, that constitutional law and structures and processes that it creates have not been the most successful in stopping or even halting authoritarian projects. At the start, I'll make this caveat that I don't contend that they are useless, but I feel that they are inadequate as the only mechanism to prevent the rise of populist authoritarian projects. So what my argument is that ultimately, authoritarian populist projects can only be prevented in the political arena and the electoral battleground. This can happen when united opposition forces utilize their institutional leverages efficiently and stop authoritarian populist projects, or win elections and prevent the reemergence of populist autocrats. And perhaps at a lot more macro level and a more weaker case, I also contend that ultimately democratic opposition forces, they need to, take some pages out of the populist toolkit and capture the people's imagination in the same way as authoritarian populist projects going forward. So one thing what I won't do is, considering most people here are aware of how, how the story is unfolded, is I won't really dig deep into individual cases and individual examples, but rather just like cover the more important points. So starting with how does the authoritarian populist project story goes. Again, most of you are familiar, and Nikolas commented, and before me, even in the other panels, people commented about how populist authoritarians, they come into the picture. But some things that I want to highlight is, which is relevant for my presentation, is that a lot of times when they come into power, they come into the background of weak and divided opposition political parties. Further, when they come into power, they promise to cleanse the old regime and create this new institutional order that's going to bring prosperity to the state and restore its past glory. Some other toolkits from their populist rhetoric is that they claim that they represent the people of the country, albeit this is often an exclusionary version, and they also claim that they are the only ones who can resolve the nation's problems. This is kind of you can't say that it's true to every authoritarian populist, but it's kind of a similar theme that we can see across authoritarian projects. Another thing what's common about especially modern day authoritarian projects is their use of legal tools to carry out their project. They use legal means, they do it incrementally, and this is quite a departure from the earlier era of autocrats, which carried out military coups and which was followed by the immediate subversion of democracy. Now it's more an incremental process. Also, another thing what populist autocrats do is they window dress their authoritarian projects with democratic innovations to kind of confound their critics. For example, if we look at most of the modern autocratic constitutions that have been drafted, they all contain an elaborate Bill of Rights. So why do they succeed? I've dealt more with this in my paper, but I think some of the most important reasons why authoritarian populists succeed with their autocratic projects is, firstly, opposition parties are weak and they're not able to put up enough resistance. Secondly, their populist rhetoric, it does give hope to a lot of the populists who otherwise feel kind of who've given up. And thirdly, a lot of times the losers with these populist projects are minorities who don't actually have a very strong bargaining ground. And lastly, a lot of these populist authoritarian projects, because they promote a very highly majoritarian view of the state, they don't encounter non-conformity issues that causes major popular backlashes. One example that always comes to my mind is the case of Afghanistan. Their new constitution was such a far departure from what were the traditional values of that country that it, from day one, faced a universal backlash because people just didn't identify with it. But unlike that, most, at least at a majoritarian level, a lot of people do identify with the majoritarian values that populist autocrats promote. So now jumping into, what really my paper is about. And it is that constitutional law and institutional mechanisms aren't the only answer to stop them, and they're not a sufficient mechanism to stop them. While there are a lot of suggestions based in constitutional law and the structures and institutions they create, bulk of the scholarly arguments, they focus on three things. And there are a few smaller things which I've also covered in my paper, but those three major ones are laws that limit abusive and unilateral constitutional change, such as revision clauses and unconstitutional constitutional amendments, firstly. Secondly, judicial institutions like constitutional courts. And third, perhaps more radical of the option, is militant or defensive democracy options like party bans and limitations or penalizing of certain so-called undemocratic electoral speech. Now, why don't these options completely work? Why are they more insufficient? So first, moving to the constitutional law tools such as revision clauses and unconstitutional constitutional amendments. Now, sadly, one of the realities is, and a lot of empirical research has proved this. More recently, Mila Versteg and Adam Chilton wrote this in the context of constitutional rights, that embedding a law in the Constitution doesn't automatically make government play by the rules. Governments abide by constitutional provisions that are not aligned with their interests when the costs of doing so are extremely high. This happens when flouting constitutional norms can usher in massive protests or cause the citizenry to vote incumbents, etc. Now, the popularity of populist autocrats, coupled with the weak state of opposition, makes constitutional provisions inadequate checks on autocrats who, as it is in a lot of the countries where such populist projects are taking birth, which have weak constitutional cultures, they tend not to respect them when these constitutional provisions don't suit them. Now, this is precisely why in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, he just simply ignored the revision clause and proceeded to draft an autocratic constitution unilaterally. What about judicial institutions? While personally, I'm a big fan of judicial institutions, and I am a big believer in their potential. Hello, can you hear me?
It's some little problems.
Hello.
We lost you for a moment. Can you start again with page 10, judicial institutions? Can you start again?
Yeah. Am I audible now?
Yes,
Sure.
yes, you are.
Okay. So I was saying, generally, while I do believe in the potential of courts to play a role, sadly and unfortunately, they are bodies without the power of the person sworn, and they do depend on the elected branches to enforce their decisions and their functionings. So they encounter similar problems as revision clauses on constitutional amendments. Governments
I'm afraid, Amal, I'm afraid we cannot hear you.
doesn't suit them, and if it's not that
Amal, can you hear
Hello?
me? Can
Yes,
you hear me?
now? I can hear you clearly.
I'm afraid you have to repeat all the page 10.
Okay.
Go on.
I'm sorry, this is happening with the internet connection. Yeah. So I was saying that judicial institutions, because of the way that they work for the enforcement, they kind of encounter the same problems as unconstitutional constitutional amendments, revision clause. In fact, if you look at a lot of courts around the world, instead of playing an active part in protecting democracy against authoritarian populist projects, they end up siding with authoritarian projects and actually democracy's demise, which David Landau and Rosalind term as abusive judicial review. And lastly, coming to defensive and militant democracy. One of the underlying problems with this and while initially the concept of militant democracy showed promise, but ultimately it's a stopgap measure when populist autocrats have the amount of popularity they have, as we can see in Turkey. The Constitutional Court banned different parties time and again, and they came in with different other them. Of the day, because judicial institutions are tasked with policing these boundaries of military, they start encountering the same problems that I discussed with courts in the previous part. And another very important factor is that the modern populist autocrat, he doesn't claim to be, he or she, they don't claim to be an anti-democratic. If anything, at least ostensibly, they claim to be democratic, to represent the will of the people. They run on kind of democratic platforms, and they carry out their democratic subversion in ostensibly democratic ways, which makes defensive militant democracy kind of an archaic tool. So also a very short point that a lot of these suggestions, they sometimes aren't really options in the countries where these kind of projects are happening. It's not necessary that there's a revision clause in the constitution. It's not necessary that there's an clause in the constitution. Similarly, judicial it's not the modern would-be autocrat does is they attack courts. So by the time they rejects, courts aren't independent anymore. So what works? And I answer that what really works can be seen in the few instances where solutions that I kind of showed some skepticism. For example, in Bolivia, the revision clause tried to remake the Bolivian constitution. But what were the set of factors in play? Evo Morales was faced by a very powerful opposition that had considerable sway and support across the country and state institutions. Similarly, in Honduras, the Constitutional Court foiled an attempt by President Zelaya in 2019 to draft a new constitution. In that case, as in Bolivia, there was a very strong political opposition, and Zelaya's own political party was against this move. So what I claim is the answer to preventing populist authoritarian projects lies in opposition forces. Further, it is contingent on the strategies they adopt. It's just not necessary that there's an opposition that acts, but their strategies are very essential. Now, in Venezuela, there was a really strong opposition that controlled the legislature, that had support across the military, across the population, etc. But they didn't use the institutional strategies well enough. They attempted a coup against Chavez and they boycotted the next elections. What this resulted in was Chavez growing stronger. Now take one of a country in the same region, Colombia. When President Uribe tried to run for a third term, an opposition that actually didn't have the numbers, they made the best use of the institutional leverages. They used delay tactics in the legislature. In the meantime, they garnered support for their initiative against Uribe, and they created the conditions necessary for the Constitutional Court to foil President Uribe's attempt to run for a third term. So what opposition forces need to do is they need to be united, they need to have clear strategies, and their actions should be continuous. There's power in numbers, as Colombia, Bolivia, Honduras show. And the importance of united opposition strategies, they go beyond just the moment of making a legal change, because in modern day authoritarian projects, they don't last for just 1 month or 2 months and everything is over. As we've seen in Turkey, Orban has been doing it for over a decade. Erdogan. In Hungary, kind of the same thing, where Orban drafted his first constitution in 2011-12, and the project is still going on. India presents a similar story. These projects go on for years. So oppositions need to continuously act. Also, they should not get complacent if they've won initial victories, because if a populist authoritarian fails, they try to use other ways to subvert democracy. Evo Morales wasn't able to draft the constitution he wanted, but that didn't stop his project. So opposition strategies are essential in the fight against populist authoritarians till they are removed from power, and they stay out of power for a while. But while at a theoretical level, this is the argument I make, in reality, bar a few instances, this is not what's happened. Unfortunately, across the world, in many countries like Hungary, Turkey, Poland, Venezuela, Brazil, India, the list just goes on. Political parties are not united. They are embroiled in their own serious issues of corruption, etc., internal disagreements, and they've been unable to keep up united fronts. In my paper, I discuss in more detail the example of India and the opposition and how the kind of state they are in. They don't even put up a viable front to Prime Minister Modi's BJP government. So things don't end up working. Before I conclude, just some more final thoughts. So autocratic populists, they come in for a reason. And if alternates can't address those reasons, autocratic populists re-emerge. So what democratic opposition forces need to do is they need to not fall into the trap that actually gave rise to autocrat populists. They need to keep their internal discourse at bay. They need to keep their house clean, and they need to make a genuine attempt to alleviate people's concerns and provide a viable alternative. Additionally, at an internal party level, they need to start establishing transparency, party level fairness, internal structures that are themselves democratic and sustained beyond a particular leader dynasty. A lot of times opposition parties, they oppose a populist autocrat, but they themselves internally don't work in a democratic way. If an opposition party wants to forward democracy, the least they can do is being democratic at an internal level. And lastly, and concluding with this, I think at a larger level, going forward, proponents of liberal democracy, they should start rethinking their democratic aspirations, because at the end of the day, the majority votes, and it's very essential to capture the majority's popular imagination. You can't just say that the bulk of the populace is dumb, or they don't just get what we are doing. So liberal and its proponents, they need to rethink their own aspirations. Democracy is a virtue worth preserving, worth fighting for, in their benefit, and that populist authoritarian projects will not solve their problem. Perhaps what they would need to do is market liberal democracy as something that's in their own interest, rather than being inflicted on by progressive elites. Pitting liberal democracy as something that's against the intrinsic values of large sections of society will do very little for it. With this, I conclude. Thank you for your time. And it was a pleasure presenting in front of you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amal. It was a real pleasure to follow your presentation. Although these little problems, technical problems we have. So we have a full 20 minutes to discuss about, and I see Costas Douzinas is asking the floor, and then Gábor Halmai. Costas, please. Costa, can you hear me?
Okay, am I on now?
Okay.
Yes, okay, sorry, I put on the camera. Now, thank you very much, Ifigeneia, and I think I really enjoyed this panel. And I think this panel, in a sense, hung together very well. I think there was a kind of common message. But I want to start with a little story that Ifigeneia and Takritis shared during the Syriza government, which, as we heard today, is perhaps left populist, authoritarian, or whatever. We were involved in a very important constitutional revision process. Ifigeneia and Takritis were centrally involved. I was one of the main presenters in Parliament. And I think it is important that we should discuss that, not today, not in this conference, but at some future minute, because it is a traumatic experience. The way in which we put together a number of important constitutional amendments, and while we passed them, then when the right wing came into power, they were all of them, or all the important ones, were deleted. And here is where I find a certain commonality in the four papers that I heard today, which I could even call them, from my own past, as it were, theoretical interventions, deconstructive. Because they deconstructed from different perspectives, some of them even opposed perspectives, a certain kind of, I think, innocence or a kind of triumphalism of constitutionalism and constitutionalization as a process, which, according to the standard mainstream textbooks and speakers, somehow can protect us from authoritarianism, from populism, from communism, what have you. Now, all four speakers, I think, in a sense, gave the lie to this idea. I think Roila said that constitutions cannot prevent illiberal democracies. Amal, that had an extremely interesting position, said more or less the same, that constitutions cannot actually prevent, in his case, illiberal authoritarianism. Of course, that was the point of Nikolas's very, I think, detailed reading of Carl Schmitt, that Schmitt is not, he is an illiberal authoritarian, but he does all that in order precisely to retain and protect the liberal economy, the liberal laissez-faire economy of the 19th century. And in a sense, my old friend Aeyal gave the answer that what is the characteristic of the kind of liberal constitutionalism that we all follow and love and talk about is, of course, its protection of a certain balance of forces, balance of power, which is economic. A balance of power which is neoliberal, some would claim it, I would claim straightforward capitalistic. And why did I mention the Greek experience? And I will stop here. We did not discuss that Greek experience. I may say very few things tomorrow because it was very traumatic, as I said, and I'm sure that was for the other hosts, Ifigeneia and Costas. But in our case, and it was not authoritarian, it was not populist, it was following the full, as it were, the full procedure and the full values of the Greek constitution as it existed. The only efficient opposition was the courts, the judges. We lost, Syriza lost every major case in the Greek courts, which of course were not deciding in any kind sort of against some illiberal or communist or authoritarian decisions. They were deciding major and on the whole mild progressive reforms, and then the courts were invalidating them one after the other. There was one opposition, and that opposition was mainly the courts, particularly the Conseil d'Etat, which is the highest administration. So just to finish, it seems to me, and I take here something that Amal said from the Indian tradition, which I also know quite well. Constitutions and laws cannot save us on their own. It is politics, it is mobilization, it is trying both through the parliamentary and social mobilization route to save ourselves that will actually place fetters, constraints upon authoritarian or indeed populist positions. Constitutions and laws and institutions are useful, but those of us who do not believe that we can be redeemed by the institutional edifice on its own, have a major job to persuade, I think, everyone that we can create a political and even radical constitutionalism which respects certain of the preconditions and the values of liberal constitutionalism, but can also allow us to move a bit further. Thank you.
Gábor?
Thank you very much, and thank you for this really great panel. I enjoyed a lot. And before I tried to make my small comments I prepared, let me echo Costas's points about the limits of the use of constitutions in order to fight against illiberalism or autocratic populism. The best proof of that is Poland, where there is a full-fledged liberal democratic constitution, which was unable to prevent the dismantlement of constitutionalism in the country. So here are my small questions and comments to the panelists. So my old friend Aeyal, I enjoyed your presentation as always. Let me have one question of clarification. So in the very beginning, you were talking about the relationship between transitional justice and backsliding. So let me ask for some clarification, because as you know, the two countries where transitional justice was the mildest among at least East Central European countries was Poland and Hungary. And yet the backsliding started in those countries, while, for instance, in Czechoslovakia, later in the Czech Republic, there was a very strong transitional justice measurement and no backsliding to compared with Poland and Hungary. My second comment or question relates to Roila's excellent presentation, and let me comment on your illiberal approach of the Hungarian Fidesz party. So two claims which were part of your characterization of this illiberal regime, illiberal democracy, was that it was a kind of counter action against economic liberalism. Let me say that this is only partly true. The current Hungarian illiberal regime is very much a neoliberal regime, abandoning any kind of equality. And the second point is what you said about against the legal elite. I very much agree with Nikolas's point here that the Hungarian regime is one of the main examples for this autocratic legalism. In other words, this is another legal elite, the Fidesz elite, which very much used autocratic legalism. Thank you very much.
Bojan?
Yeah, just also enjoyed very much this panel. Just two quick points, one to Nikolas and the second to Aeyal. So to Nikolas, you ended up with a very interesting point about compatibility between neoliberalism and authoritarian populism. I just wanted to flag the point that there's already a word out there in the literature which calls this combination in certain context plutocratic populism. So when Pearson and Hacker write about US, in their Let Them Eat Their Tweets, they call Trump a plutocratic populist. So he delivered mostly to the elites, and he promised tweets to the masses, right? And some people think similarly about Boris Johnson, so sort of a soft version of that. Just maybe help for a further development of your thoughts and your paper. And about Aeyal, I really enjoyed I really welcome his sort of contribution to this almost complete lack of introspection on the part of a liberal elite. So when you listen about this debate about populism and anti-populism and liberalism, it is very, very rare to find a liberal who actually tries to take a critical sort of introspections and think about what liberalism contributed to this populist moment. And I wonder if Aeyal in his work already how much is this let's call it because it's coming from Aeyal, I suppose it will be sort of a left wing version critique of liberalism. How much can it gain from the current conservative critique of liberalism, which is quite strong? And I'm thinking about people like John Deanan, and Paul Brockert mentioned Legutko. So there's a burgeoning literature on the right which takes the aim directly at liberalism. So how much can be learned for the purposes of progressive critique of liberalism? Thanks.
Thank you, Boyan. Eleni Kalabakou.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for such an interesting panel. I really enjoyed it too. I have a small question to Mrs. Mavrouli. As I understood, you said that the theorizing of human rights as value judgments is strictly connected to the rise of illiberalism. Who is the subject of this theorizing? I mean, who does this theorizing? Aren't they liberals who do this, or are the courts? Maybe someone would say that the courts are responsible for this theorizing because the courts are the responsible for safeguarding human rights. Could we see there a responsibility of the constitutional courts? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eleni. Is there any other comment or question? Okay, before to give back the floor to the intervenants, I would like a very short comment with my poor English. If law and constitutional law could construct the social reality, the practice directly, then murders had stopped since Hammurabi Code. But we cannot, I think there is unanimity on the acceptation that without law is the rights of the social dominant groups that will rule society, and without constitutional law is the political power of the most powerful social groups that will rule the state. So back to Aeyal.
Hi, yes, thanks again for those questions. So I just go very, very briefly. So about the questions that both Costas and Gábor raised about the limits of constitutionalism to protect from those authoritarian trends, etc. Yes, absolutely. And I think that actually we can see, and this also relates to what Amal said, if you look in my written paper, you see many small steps that we talk about a lot, and Kim Lane Shapley wrote about this, the incremental steps. So for example, in Israel, there were very small steps like changing the combination of the Judicial Appointments Committee. That there used to be the 2 members of parliament represented, and it used to be one from the coalition, one from the opposition, and now both are from the coalition. So it's like a small step of changing of 1 member. And the reason I'm mentioning it is that many steps like this were challenged before the court, but the Supreme Court upheld them in Israel. It did not intervene. And I think Amal's paper is very important here about the limits of what courts can do. And also, I recall the points that Mark Tashnet made, that because today so much of constitutional review is about proportionality, that it looks really at very specific cases, and it's very difficult for a court to see the bigger picture. And so I agree about the limits of what constitutionalism or constitutional law can do here. And this is true not only in Poland, also in Israel, where we have kind of complex situation of constitutional review, but this is to say it briefly. Gábor, about the transitional justice and backsliding, yes, of course, my comparison was more about the discourses, the academic discourses, how they're structured. In both cases, this ideal of liberal democracy we should aspire to, or we are deteriorating from. I mentioned Hungary and Poland as 2 cases which are at the heart of it, but yes, of course, there are other cases in East and Central Europe where the situation is very different. Why and what are the differences between those countries? with you and Boyan here, I'm not going to say anything about East and Central Europe. You can say much better than me. But absolutely, and this maybe has to do also with part of my point about the comparative research that sometimes has to be more nuanced and fine-tuned to the specifics of each country, which I try to make in the case of Israel, that there are so many specifics that sometimes putting it within this framework doesn't really make sense all the way. And last one, Boyan, about very interesting, the right-wing critique of liberalism. Can we learn from it? You know, I didn't read Dinan or Legutko, but we mentioned before different teachers we had when we studied together many years ago at Harvard. So one of them was Stephen Macedo, who was also from this school of actually studied the class with him on liberal constitutionalism and its critiques that he taught with Peter Berkovich. So they were both kind of conservatives. So yes, it's, you know, I have to think about it, but I think it goes to a more general point, and it's, by the way, a very, very important point in Israel today, the right-wing critiques of liberalism, and also the right-wing critique of legalism and liberal constitutionalism as a way to make political decisions. And sometimes, for a moment, it can sound to you like this critical legal studies tradition that you said you were educated, as you know, me too, both of us were educated in this tradition, and I see Costas here, who's been that's, you know, where we first met him in those conferences. But I also always remind myself there's a very big difference between a critique of liberal constitutionalism and liberalism and legalism from the left, which says that those systems do not deliver on their promise of justice, equality, substantial equality, economic equality, racial equality, sexual equality, etc. They do not deliver on it. They promise it, but, you know, and this all goes back to the Marxist critique, right? We couldn't do without him. And the right-wing critiques, which are not interested in, actually are not interested in achieving this equality. They're actually criticizing it because they think those systems to some extent give some equality or some, and they're not interesting in it. They're interesting often to maintain the economic or ethnic or racial or sexual hierarchies. So I think that's a very big difference. We always have to remember that the critical agenda or the critical legal studies agenda, for example, was not just a method. It had a politics, right? It has a politics. So I would very interesting to write to, you know, to go back to those right-wing critique, but I will and think about, can we learn from them? But I always also want to remember, you know, what is their purpose, which is very different than the left critique. Thank you.
Thank you. Roila. Roila, we not open your microphone. Okay.
Yes. So a very quick response to Eleni Kalabakou's question. So for the first question, what is the role of courts? Actually, if we accept that there is constitutionalism, that there is a sort of constitutionalism, of course, the courts are responsible. But there are some authors that say that within these regimes, we have constitutions without constitutionalism. So if this is the case, then the role of courts comes to a second place. It's afterwards that needs to be taken into consideration. So, and then on the question, who is theorizing that human rights will open the gate to this illiberal movement? Actually, we know that the Constitution, legal positivism, protects human rights within the Constitution. But then we have the interpretation of this constitution by the judges. So the illiberal movement can legitimize a different approach on human rights, which is based on legal positivism. The constitution is neutral, is not ideological. We do not promote an ideological aspect of democracy, because that would mean that we are actually accepting natural law ideas. So actually, this is the problem, because this is the ideological aspects behind, that is hiding behind the neutrality of the law. And then courts can, of course, have a role in this. But of course, once again, this has to do with the procedural aspect of democracy as theorized by Habermas. And there are some authors that say that these procedural aspects, the rationalization of law, of democracy, and the role of courts is actually the problem. And this actually, that's the reason for this rise of the liberal movement. I don't know if this has answered in some way.
Thank you, Roila. I have many questions, but I will send them in written to you. So, Nikolas.
Yes. First of all, I will be brief. First of all, I would like to thank for Costas, Gábor, and Bojan for their comments on my presentation, and Bojan especially for his bibliographical suggestion. Regarding now the question of Costas Stratilatis that was in the chat, he asked, shall I read the question briefly, quickly? Costas asks if there is something in Schmitt to suggest a tendency of extreme economic liberalism with authoritarianism. I think that in Schmitt's theory, this compatibility of complementarity between economic liberalism and authoritarianism can be seen throughout his whole Weimar theory, but it becomes especially visible during the early 30s, especially in this text, in this speech actually, that I cited, Strong State, Sound Economy, that he delivered before the Rhineland industrialists, in late 1932, in November 1932. He argued clearly in this speech for a depoliticization of the economy by a strong state, and he clearly opposed the Weimar economic constitution, the Weimar call for economic democracy, actually. So it becomes visible, particularly visible during the early 30s, that there is a complementarity with Schmitt's theory between economic liberalism and authoritarianism. Yeah, that's all. Thank you all for your comments, and thanks again for the opportunity to present my my paper.
Amal?
Hello. Thank you, everyone, for your comments. So I'm going to address one overarching question that kind of came up again and again, and perhaps my own views on it. So one clarification I want to make is I don't think I'm an anti-constitutionalist. I don't think constitutionalism is a waste. It's useless. I would rather call myself a constitutional skeptic. I think what constitutionalism is, it's not sufficient. However, I talk about the importance of opposition strategies. And a lot of times what constitutionalism can do is it can provide oppositions that very valuable tool to kind of invoke and fight against illiberalism, authoritarian populism. And that's happened again and again. And especially in this era of autocratic legalism, autocrats, they kind of, at least at a macro level, want to show that they play by the rules. So in these moments, constitutionalism, constitutions, they can be a very valuable speed bump. But I think speed bump or a backstop is what personally I think is best what we can expect of them. But that again, that doesn't mean that we get rid of constitutionalism. That plays a very important part in the larger system, but it isn't sufficient. And we need to start both in our discourse and in our real life political strategies, start looking beyond that, because that, at least I feel that that's not going to be our ultimate savior. And thank you so much. Thank you to my co-panelists, and thank you for the organizers for this opportunity.
It's time to thank you warmly all, and wish you a good continuation in your work. I give the floor to my dear colleague Eleni Lapa, who will conduct the next session and last for today. Thank you all.
Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you to the last panel for today. Our topic is the sovereign people and the constitution. Without further ado, I shall give the floor first to Professor Papastylianos from the University of Nicosia. Mr. Papastylianos, welcome.